Hello, everyone. It's me again, Lloyd Brooks, in my Idiot's Guide series. So, what I'm going to do today is go into what early church fathers said about manuscripts. And I think this is a neglected subject. What we normally find with textual criticism, they look at manuscripts, they look at canons. I'm talking about modern textual criticism, but they don't look at the context of the times that these manuscripts were completed. So what I'm going to do is look at some of the things and see how they match up, yeah, what the early church fathers said about the manuscripts of their day and in particular locations. So the reason why the early church fathers are quite key, one, we have a period of time when they ministered. We also have the location where they ministered, and they would be best placed to identify about the manuscripts of their time. So let's have a look. Eh? Right. I said modern textual seems to operate within a historical vacuum without taking into account the historical context. What the literature finds about scribal habits or even heresies. So we're going to go into this, and some of the things I'm going to probably repeat myself is that one, for example, when manuscripts were written, what was the dominant heresy at the time? For example, Arianism in the fourth century. Um, what was the in terms of issues that was going on at the time. So what we're going to do, we're going to go into this at this time, yeah. So uh, Kurt and Barbara Land, right? All the papyri before the third and fourth century. This is from their book, The Text of the New Testament, are placed in the highest category because of their age, even when their free text sets them a distance from the original. Now that's a very key point, free text, because in terms of what that term free text is talking about, everyone was doing their own thing. So even though it's the papyri, they put it in the highest category, so it was like five categories. Category one was the ones that was least contaminated, purest from the Byzantine type. So they saw the Byzantine type text as corrupted, and therefore category one was those early papyri, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, had the least corruption from the Byzantine type text. So the term free text means is that they weren't linked to each other, and it was basically a free for all, so to speak. All right. All right. So here's the thing. Really good paper if you can get hold of it. Amy M. Donaldson. And what happened was is that she wrote a paper about in terms of historical and social factors. Now I'm just going to talk about the part involved. There are a number of historical and social factors that influence discussions of the New Testament text. From Marcion to Arius to Oregon, accusations of heresy impacted how particular variants were understood, where certain scholars drew the lines between trusted sources and the enemies of the church. Now, this is why this is really important. What you find is that modern textual criticism, and this goes back to Griesbach, they were suspicious of orthodoxy. In the early church and the early Christians, the issue was heresy. So if you look at Bar Irma, he talks about the orthodox corruption of the New Testament. So what you find is what guides their principles was a suspicion of orthodoxy, even though the early church's issue was heresy. So even if you look at scribal habits, they look at amendments tending towards orthodoxy. But that wasn't the issue with the early church; it was heresy. So this is why you find, for example, Matthew chapter 1, verse 7 and verse 10. He talks about Asa when we know, well, the correct reading is Asa, and the false reading is Asaph, and Ammon is the correct reading, but Amos. So what the modern textual critic looks at, they look at there was an error in the scripture, and scribes more likely to change it to the correct reading. So there's a suspicion of orthodoxy going back to Griesbach. So Griesbach actually said, if it's wrong, it may eventually turn out to be right. And this is based on the canon of suspicion of orthodoxy. That if the scribe came along, saw an error, the the incorrect reading was the correct reading. Yeah. So the good was the bad, and the bad was the good. Yeah. Okay. So what did Oregon say? Now this is we don't talk about this here, but let's see if it's backed up by the facts. One of the clearest early statements on scribal habits, mistakes in textual alteration. This is what he said in his commentary on Matthew 15:14. The difference among the manuscripts have become great, either through the negligence of some copies or through perverse audacity of others. They either neglect to check what they have transcribed or in the process of checking, lengthen or shorten as they please. Now, here's an interesting point. Look where Oregon was the second and going to the third century. Do we see a disparity of manuscripts in that time in Alexandria? Yeah, that's because this is what Oregon's saying about the manuscript in his time in the second and the third century. And no doubt may have influenced manuscripts in the fourth century. So one of the key things you will see in terms of scribal habits, there's a lot of singular readings, a lot of errors in Appri. So let's go on. So many New Testament manuscripts different to scribes, accuses scribes of correcting, geography and harmonizing, avoids conjecture, mark variants, present multiple readings for exegesis. And we see that. Didymus Sublime, he frequently reports variants without firm judgment, uses both readings for exegesis, sometimes preferring readings for scriptural coherence. Now, this is was missed out. You no doubt would have heard the contract Mark 16:9-20. Now, one of the things that's missed out with his Eusebius comment about Mark 69:20, he said they were loath to get rid of. They saw two variant readings. They were loath to get rid of one of them, just in case it was the genuine scripture. So that's a lot missed out in terms of with Eusebius. Yeah. So they quote the first part without quoting all of his statement. But that's for another time. Dionysius of Corinth. In a letter to the church at Rome, when my fellow Christians invited me to write letters to them, I wrote these, the apostles of the devil are filled with tears, take away some things and adding others. From them the woe is prepared. Now he's talking about letters that he wrote. That seemed to write. Tertullian. Now remember, the, the issue of corruption was promulgated at heresy. Modern scribal scholars studied scribal habits, looked at orthodoxy, that the scribes corrected the manuscripts to be orthodox rather than heretical. But the early church fathers don't say that. Eusebius of Caesarea, all right, referring to wherefore they are boldly corrupt, they, not us, they have boldly corrupted the divine scriptures, set aside the rule of the ancient faith. If anyone takes the trouble to collect their respective copies and compare them, he will discover the great discrepancy between them. Now, this is talking about heresy. As I said and repeat again, modern textual scholars go against what the fathers are saying. They're looking that where there was an error, it's correct. And as my friend said, the hermeneutic of suspicion. Irenaeus, they alter scripture, misinterpret them to support their doctrines. This is Gnostic tampering. Tertullian, Marcion, use a knife, not the pen, he excised passages. So this is where the emphasis of early church fathers, not the orthodox corruption of scripture, but in terms of corruption of scripture ranked to heresy, going against what Bart Ehrman's saying and then modern scholars. Oregon, difference arise from negligence of audacity of copies. We've gone through that. All right. So this is summing up all among the manuscripts. The differences are many. So here's the thing I want to bring up, 4th century, is that what we find that if what they're saying is true, we'd expect major differences in the early manuscripts. We wouldn't see a homogeneous manuscript. We'd also see error, a doctrinal error. For example, John 1:18. John 1:18, only begotten God. Now, that is erroneous. Why? Because at the time when it came to the Arianism, is that he didn't believe that Jesus was God. So we're looking at scriptures which have been corrupted and bringing error doctrinally. For example, Jesus coming in the flesh, God who was manifest in the flesh. We see he who was manifest in the flesh, which is a nonsense reading, but we see there are as many virgins as there are copies. You know. Augustine, some grammarians and copies have erred by adding or omitting words. All right. Now, here's the thing. Look what the fathers are saying. So we see early corruption with the earliest manuscripts. But here we notice from the 6th century going on, we see, he says, Cassiodorus says, copy sacred text with reverence as if compromising divine oracles. So we see here that admission to be careful what you're copying. Do we see that in the latter manuscripts? Isidore of Seville, 7th century. A copyist must not change anything based on memory. You see that the admonition, because now you have scriptoriums. Alcuin of York, sacred rite should be copied by the best scribes. Theodore of Studium, 9th century. Now, this is what he says: altering the text of scripture warrants excommunication. So notice here, we see a comparison between the early manuscripts is that often amateur inconsistent literacy. Medieval manuscripts, formal training, sculpture, scriptorium. Uh, early manuscripts, informal, unstable, home-based. Monastic and urban and professional scriptorium. Common errors, theological edits, harmonization, letter confusion. Abbreviation mistakes, stylist quirks, orthographic smoothing. Variant context, high fathers discuss variants explicitly. Low amongst the scribes, high in universities. And standard, low textual unity, high textual normalization. So what we see here is that there were more meticulous in the latter period, especially from the 9th century onwards. And so we see here there was a lot of errors in terms of copying with the early manuscripts. So I'll give you an example. I think Luke 1:27, and I think I may come across that later with Codex Sinaiticus, where it has Nazareth in Judea, when really it's in Galilee. Yeah, so there's a lot of errors there. So let's go in. So Farnes did his study, right? So interesting. I always talk about Alan Taylor Farnes' study. His one was quite unique. Well, not unique. There was also Andrew Wilson, where he looked at early manuscripts and he said early papyri have high error rates. So he looked at early manuscripts, P45, with the same ones as James Royce, P45, P46, P47, P66, P72, and P75, which is a new one introduced because and he said they emit more than they add. So high variation. This is what Oregon said. High variation. This is what Eusebius said. Include numerous singular readings, exhibit inconsistent copying. Royce made a conclusion which France confirms early scribes tend to omit more text and the errors were significantly higher. What does he say about the latter manuscripts? Because remember, he used two aspects: singular readings for the early papyri. For the latter, he took four um, uh, minuscules, uh, and then he looked at the exemplar and looked at the copies and said middle-late medieval scribes with much greater precision demonstrate that 96th century manuscripts in his study have very low error rates, rarely create singular reads, produce almost no substantive variants, copy with near mechanical fidelity. So what you see here is a looking what the early father said. Does it match up what we have today? Yes, it does. So for example, Oregon said there was great variation. Do we see that? We see it with France's study. What about the latter manuscripts? Very low error rates in terms of singular readings, etc. And also, if you mention, look at KR, coin, coin revision, or the family 35, they were meticulously had virtually identical copies. So I hope you've learned something. I said I've learned something from this. God bless you, God keep you, and I hope you enjoyed that, or you've learned something.